In this video, we're going to be doing the hardware overview. Behind me, I have the ProX console surface, my stage rack, as well as my front of house rack. My system contains one Midas Neutron engine fitted with a Neutron NB card, two DN9680 AES50 extenders converted over to multi-mode, as well as three DL151 I/O boxes, one 152 I/O box, and a DL451 at front of house. Also in the system, I have two RPM Dynamics devices, one MS48 mini server, as well as a TB72R. Let's go ahead and take a look at these more in depth. Here we are now at the stage rack. I'm going to go over the different components from top to bottom in the rack. First, we have a DN9680. As I mentioned, I converted these to multi-mode. Out of the box, these come as a single mode fiber. So for any of you folks that already are using multi-mode fiber with the current Midas system, you would not be able to get connectivity if you just had it in the stock configuration. The stock configuration will allow you to reach 1,500 meters with the single mode. When you convert to the multi-mode, you only have 500 meters of connectivity. For me, that's not a problem, so that's why I needed to go ahead and convert it over to multi-mode, so this way I can use existing fiber option connections. Let's take a look at the front panel and see what we have. Looking at the front here of the DN9680, first we have our Ethernet control. On the back, this is where we'd be able to connect our laptop computer to be able to configure the device. We're going to be getting into that in a separate video, as well as how to convert the unit to multi-mode fiber. Next, we have our 8 AES50 status lights. On ports 1 and 2, I have my DL451 patched in from front of house. Ports 3 through 7, I have connected to my RPM Dynamics devices that I'm using for multi-track recording. On port 8, as you see, we have an error status light that's letting us know that we don't have positive connection. And that's okay. We don't have anything connected on that, and it won't cause a problem if you're not using all 8 AES50 ports. Next is the snake selection. Currently, I have it configured for the optical snake. If you want to go ahead and use the copper side for Cat5e, you can go ahead and do that in the configuration. Next, we have our clock source. Currently, I have this configured to the external AES50. This DN9680 here at the stage is connected to our Neutron NB card. Because the Neutron is actually set up as our master clock, that's where we want to make sure that we're getting our clock source from so that the entire system is operating on the same clock. It also gives you the option to run this internally as well as an external snake. When we go over the front of house DN9680, I'll be explaining in more detail how this needs to be configured so these two units can actually talk together. And last, we have the display. On the top row, we see the IP address of the DN9680. This is not something that we need to be worried about or too concerned with, so we could just go ahead and ignore that for now. Below that, we have a readout of the actual connections. Again, as we see, ports 1 through 7, we're seeing connection because we are connected to devices. And lastly, all the way here on the M, you'll notice this M here. This is indicating that the unit is actually in a multi-mode configuration. Next, we have the Neutron DSP engine that's fitted with a Neutron NB card. Let's take a look at the front panel. In the top left, we have our status indication for the Ethernet tunnel. Below that is the system clock, which is indicating that the Neutron is actually the master clock for the entire system. Below that, we have our status lights for our power supply units. Here, we have the status indication lights for our snake systems for X and Y. Below that is our sync source. Right now, everything is synced internally. Below that, we have our DSP indicator lights for our 4 DSP cards, and we see that those are functioning normally. Next, we have our 8 AES50 ports. These are the 8 AES50 ports that are actually within the Neutron engine, not the Neutron NB card. Right now, I have my I/O boxes here at the stage. So we have both the X and the Y connections for the 4 I/O boxes, which is giving us our 8 connections. And last, we have 10 additional AES50 ports that are on the back of the Neutron NB card. If you remember in discussing the DN9680, you'll know that I'm only using ports 1 through 7 for devices, so that's why port 8 is in an error mode right now. Again, this is not something that you need to worry about. If you do not have anything connected to that and that red light is on, it's not going to affect your system. Next, we have the 4 I/O boxes. In my setup, I have 3 DL151s. Each one of these gives me 24 channels of analog inputs, and I have 1 DL152, which gives me 24 channels of analog outputs. So let's take a look at the front of the I/O boxes. Right now, we'll just look at the 151. It doesn't matter if we're on the 152 or 153. It doesn't matter. As long as it's a 1.5 series, the front's going to be exactly the same. So here on the left, we have the status lights for our power supply units. Next to that, we have Ethernet control. Again, we can connect the laptop in there if we needed to configure these boxes for any reason. Next are our status lights for our AES-50. Right now, as I said, we have 2 lines connected into the Neutron engine. Both of these are on Cat 5e cables. All right, we see the status is green, and if we were to lose any of these snake connections, we would be presented with a red status light. Next, we have the display for the box. I went ahead and custom labeled all the I/O boxes so I know which box is which. And as you see here on the first unit, it's set to DL151 number 1 at the stage. Below that is the stock name of the I/O box. Next, we have the 4 buttons to be able to access the menu. Let's go ahead and take a look and see what options we have. If we press and hold the menu button in, the first thing that we get is our clock source. Right now, it's clocking on the AES-50. If we wanted to go ahead and go in and change that, we can just press this in and we can make different selections and the unit changed, and you see that the status lights were indicating as such. We press the menu again. This is where we need to set the ID for the I/O box. This is very, very important because each I/O box needs to have its own ID. And for instance, with my setup, because I have 3 DL151s and a 152 here at the stage, I need to set the IDs to make sure that they show up exactly the way they need to be. Moving on, we have the sample rate. After that, this gives us the information for our CBMA. This is basically for the software. Next is the software version. So we always want to make sure that our I/O boxes, as well as our control surface and Neutron engines, are all operating on the same firmware. This can cause some problems if your I/O box is on a different firmware. We're going to be doing the firmware update in a separate video, so more on that. Next, we have my front of house rack. Let's go over from top to bottom of all the components that I have going on. On top here, I have my laptop running my acoustic measurement software. To the right of that, I have my iPad where I have the Midas Mixtender 2 app installed, which allows me to control the console. In a separate video, I'm going to be going how to set up and configure an iPad to be able to use with the Pro Series console. Next in the rack, I have a Waves Max BCL hardware unit. Currently, I have this device connected via AES inserted across my master bus on the console. I also have additional outputs and inputs to be able to insert it via analog in the event that I have any issues with the digital. Below that, I have a SansAmp PSA-1. This is another hardware unit that I'm using for vocal distortion. Next, we have my Midas DL451. The 451 I/O is a configurable I/O box allowing you to have 3 cards. In my setup, I have 8 analog inputs, 8 analog outputs, as well as 8 channels of AES EBU in and out. The 451 also has MIDI in, out, and through ports on the back, which I'm actually utilizing in Snapshot Automation Recall to be able to recall presets in my SansAmp PSA-1. Now let's take a look at the front panel and see what we have. So here on the front of the 451, we have the status lights for the power supply unit. Next to that, we have our indicator lights for our Ethernet control. Ethernet control would be allowing us to connect our laptop in if we needed to configure the box. Next, we have our AES-50 connection indications. Right now, I have 2 lines going into the DN9680 for our X and our Y connections. One is acting as the main and the other as the redundant. Next, we have the display for the DL451. In the top line, I went ahead and gave it a custom name indicating this is the 451 here at front of house. On the second line, we're seeing here that this is the number 1 ID for the 451 in the Midas ProX system. To the right of that, we have 4 buttons, which allow us to toggle through the different menu options. Let's take a look and see what we have. If we go ahead and press in the menu button, the first item that we're presented with is the clocking source. Currently, this is being clocked on the AES 50 ports that are connected to the DN9680, which are then connected to the Neutron NB at the stage. Next, number 2, this is where we're going to go ahead and set the ID. This is very, very important, and this is definitely where you're going to be going once you get your I/O box configured. You want to make sure that you set the ID properly. So for my system, this ID number is number 1 because this is the only 451 that I have in my system. Next, on number 3, we have the CBMA version. This is basically some of the information for the internal software. Next, we have the software version information. This is very, very important. We want to be able to make sure that not only all of our I/O systems as well as the console are all operating on the same software firmware. If we have later or earlier versions, we could definitely run into some problems with the system and it won't function properly. So go ahead and make sure that you're all operating on the latest, newest firmware updates. I'm going to be going over firmware updates in a separate video, so stay tuned for that. Next, number 5 is digital boards. So if you have an AES EBU card installed, this is information that's important for you. So for you folks that do not have a digital card installed, you can go ahead and skip over this. So let's go ahead and select on here and see what our options are. We're presented with the boards A, B, and C. On my setup, I have my digital card installed on board B. So I'm going to scroll down and select. The first menu option we have is the clock setup. So let's go ahead and select that. As you see here, we're given the options to change the clock on channels 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, or 7 and 8. For the video, let's just work on channels 1 and 2. So let's go ahead and hit select. We're now presented with 96K or 48K. I'm going to go ahead and leave this in 96. Next, we have our SRC options, which stands for sample rate conversions. So let's go ahead and select that. As you see, we can change the sample rate conversion on the outputs for channels 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, or 7 and 8. We also have the option, if we keep scrolling, we can have it on the inputs for channels 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, as well as 7 and 8. I already have this set up, so I'm going to go ahead and leave this alone. And last, we have the word size. So let's go ahead and select again. Again, we're presented with having the word on channels 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, or 7 and 8. For this video, let's select channels 1 and 2. This gives us the option to have 24 bits, 20 bits, or 16-bit. I'm going to go ahead and leave this on 24-bit. And last, we have number 6 for snake mode. Let's go ahead and select that. Right now, we're presented with the snake mode off. This is very, very important. Let's make sure that we leave snake mode off, especially if we're going to be using it with our ProX system. Snake mode is normally if we're going to be using 2 DL451s where we need to use the snake controller software. So if I was to select snake mode on, the I/O box is going to lose complete connection to the console. So let's go ahead again and leave that off. Next, we have my Lake LM44 audio system processor. I have all of my console outputs patched into this, both digitally and analog, for connectivity to the PA system. Next in the rack is my Sonnet Fusion R400 RAID system. This allows me to have 4 internal hard drives installed. The way I have it set up is on drives 1 and 2, I have set to a RAID 10 system, which allows me to have 16 terabytes. This is what I use for my main drive. On drives 3 and 4, it's the same thing, RAID 10, but this is serving as my backup drive. So as I'm recording my shows, it's printing to both hard drives at the same time, so I don't have to waste time doing backups each day. This is actually connected via USB 3.0 inside the MS48 from RPM Dynamics, where I have a Mac Mini that's actually running my Waves Track software to capture the multi-track recording. Next, we have my RPM Dynamics MS48 mini server. Inside of this, I have a Mac Mini computer installed. It also has 2 Lynx cards installed. Each of these cards is giving me 24 channels of bidirection AES-50 audio. This is what I'm using for my multi-track recording as well as my virtual playback. Next, we have my RPM Dynamics TB72R. Inside this, I have 3 more additional Lynx cards, all giving me 24 channels of bidirectional AES-50 audio each. In total, I have 120 channels of multi-track record as well as playback at 96K. Next, we have my DN9680 here at front of house. As I mentioned earlier, I already went ahead and converted these to multi-mode fiber. Let's take a look at the front unit in depth. Here on the left-hand side, you see ports 1 through 7 are illuminated green, letting us know that it's connected to all of my devices. Again, and I can't stress this enough, with number 8 not connected to any devices, that's why we have this red error light. It is okay for us to operate the system while we have an error light on the DN9680s. Here we can see that we have a positive connection with our optical snake between the front of house DN9680 and the stage DN9680. We can also confirm that we have the optical snake selected. And last, we have our clock source. Just to reiterate that this is extremely important that we configure the 2 DN9680s properly, because if we don't, then we're not going to have connection between the 2 devices. Here, I have the clock set to external snake. That's because it's getting the clock information down the optical fiber snake that's connected to the DN9680 on the stage. The stage DN9680 is plugged into the back of the neutron and it's getting its clocking source from the external AES.